Welcome to This Explainer. We hear the phrase national debt thrown around constantly, but honestly, the sheer scale of the numbers makes it almost impossible to grasp what it actually means for your wallet and the broader economy. So today, we're cutting through the noise and breaking down the trillion-dollar reality of government borrowing.
$1 trillion. That is a massive number. And get this, that is just the annual interest payment on the United States national debt, right? That's not even paying down the principal. That is just the cost of carrying the debt for a single year. When numbers get this incredibly large, it's absolutely crucial to understand the mechanics behind them rather than just treating them as abstract concepts.
To put that trillion into perspective, the cost of simply servicing our past borrowing now outpaces the entire national defense budget. When interest payments eclipse the funding for the entire Pentagon, literally every ship, jet, and soldier, economists of all stripes start paying very, very close attention.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the trillion-dollar milestone, the crowding out effect, ask whether the Fed is monetizing debt, explore modern monetary theory, and wrap up with context and economic conditions.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the trillion-dollar milestone, and exactly why it matters. Like I said, we hear about the debt all the time, but what actually happens to a borrowed dollar once it enters the real economy? Does it kickstart growth, or does it kind of just siphon resources away from the private sector, making it harder for you, say, to get a mortgage or a small business loan? Well, to answer that, we've got to look at our first economic framework. Which brings us to Section 2, the crowding out effect. This is the traditional macroeconomic view. Think of the national savings pool as finite. It's limited. When the government runs a deficit and needs to borrow money, it basically shrinks the savings available for everybody else. Since the government is now competing with private businesses for that limited pool of cash, borrowing costs, interest rates, get pushed up. The result? Fewer private business projects and home purchases actually make financial sense anymore. The government literally crowds out the private sector.
But, this effect isn't always 100% absolute. Usually we see what's called partial crowding out. Some private investment gets bumped, sure, but a net economic stimulus still happens. Complete crowding out, where every single borrowed government dollar destroys a private dollar, that really only happens if the economy is already running at absolute max capacity. On the flip side, you get zero crowding out during deep recessions.
All right, let's switch gears to Section 3. Is the Fed monetizing debt? This is the monetary view.
True debt monetization means a central bank permanently prints new money for the sole purpose of funding government deficits. But here's a pretty surprising fact. Buying freshly printed debt directly from the Treasury, that's actually been completely illegal in the United States since 1981. So, if direct printing is outlawed, what exactly is the Federal Reserve doing when it buys trillions in bonds?
Well, strictly speaking, quantitative easing, or QE, is not true monetization. Why? Because the private sector, like big pension funds, still buys the debt first at Treasury auctions. The Fed just buys it secondhand on the open market, creating interest-bearing reserves in the process. Plus, these balance sheet increases are designed to be temporary. Eventually, the Fed just lets those securities mature.
However, there is kind of a backdoor monetization going on. See, the Federal Reserve earns massive interest on the vast portfolio of securities it holds. After paying its own bills, those leftover profits, which are called remittances, are sent directly back to the Treasury. In 2020 alone, these remittances basically wiped out roughly 25% of the Treasury's net interest payments. So while the open market finances the bulk of the interest burden, a full quarter of it was just neutralized by the central bank's own profits.
Now let's look through a totally different lens in Section 4. Modern monetary theory, or MMT. This is the heterodox view. To really grasp MMT, we've got to start with fiat money. This whole framework rests on a pretty bold premise. A sovereign government is the absolute monopoly issuer of its own fiat currency. Unlike you, me, or a business, a government printing its own currency can never go bankrupt. It can't be forced to default on debt denominated in that currency. They don't need to find the money to spend. They literally just create it.
MMT completely flips the script on how we normally think about taxes and spending. In this view, the government actually has to spend money into existence before citizens even have the currency to pay their taxes in the first place. So taxation doesn't fund government spending. Instead, taxes are just a tool used to destroy money, basically reducing private consumption to cool down demand pull inflation.
So, you might be wondering, if the government can always just print money, what's the limit?
Well, MMT economists actually agree on this. The limit is inflation. When the economy runs out of real physical resources like labor and materials, prices go up. To manage that inflation without relying on mass unemployment, MMT advocates for an automatic stabilizer. Things like a federally funded guaranteed jobs program to automatically anchor prices and manage demand.
Which brings us to Section 5, Context and Economic Conditions. Let's synthesize all these lenses. Because at the end of the day, economic context is everything. Think back to the 1980s under the Reagan administration. The government ran large deficits while the economy was near full capacity. The result? Classic crowding out. Real interest rates spiked and private investment got displaced because resources and savings were scarce. But fast forward to the 2009 post-financial crisis stimulus. The government ran massive deficits, nearly 10% of GDP, yet interest rates stayed incredibly low. Why? Because we were in a deep recession. Borrowing didn't crowd out private investment because spare resources and savings were just sitting idle.
And this really hits the nail on the head. The magnitude of crowding out depends critically on economic conditions. The rules of debt just aren't static. If you borrow when resources are maxed out, you're going to displace the private sector. But if you borrow when resources are idle, you might just stimulate growth without a penalty. So whether you subscribe to the traditional view, keep a close eye on central bank balance sheets, or lean toward modern monetary theory, one universal constraint stands across every single one of these economic theories: inflation. As annual interest payments cross that trillion-dollar mark, the ultimate question isn't just about the size of the debt. If inflation is the only true limit to government borrowing, how close are we to the ceiling? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.